The shuttle's descent tore through the early morning mist like a silver blade, disturbing the eerie silence that blanketed the towering alien forest. As it landed in a clearing, steam hissed from its hull, mingling with the low-hanging fog that clung stubbornly to the gnarled roots and phosphorescent moss of the forest floor. The doors opened with a hydraulic sigh, and 12 Xerian cadets stepped out, their posture straight, their glossy blue exoskeletons reflecting the soft green glow of bioluminescent vines overhead. They looked every bit the future leaders of the Interstellar Accord, calm, confident, and cloaked in the quiet arrogance of top-tier intellect. Trailing behind them, boots sinking slightly into the moss, came Lieutenant Alara Morgan, the only human in sight. Clad in well-worn fatigues and a pack strapped tightly to her back, she surveyed the dense woodland with a cool, appraising gaze. Her brown hair was tied back in utilitarian braid, and a blade hung from her belt. Not ceremonial, not advanced, just sharp and dependable. She didn't bother masking her bemusement as the cadets formed a tight circle, chittering in the low, vibrating tones of Xerian speech, heads bowed over sleek Riskin souls and blinking holomaps. Commander Vrel floated down last, descending from the shuttle in a quiet gravity harness, his elongated form composed and imposing. He glanced at Alara briefly before addressing cadets in a firm, clipped tone. This is not a simulation. You will receive no additional supplies, no communications, and no data feeds. You will survive here for 48 hours. You will demonstrate initiative, adaptability, and leadership, and you will do so with the same tools any primitive species would use. No tech, no shortcuts, only instinct, intellect, and will. A few cadets stiffened. One, taller than the rest, flicked his gaze toward Alara. "And the human?" he asked, the translator embedded in his throat modulating his voice into clear, crisp standard. "Is she part of the test?" "She is your observer," Vrel replied. "Do not expect her to intervene. She is here to watch. Nothing more." Alara offered him a faint, almost lazy smile, then walked away from the group and into the tree-line, where the fog thickened and the trees rose like ancient guardians. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The first few hours unfolded exactly as she had expected. The Xerians, relying on centuries of cultural superiority and analytical prowess, attempted to map and categorize their surroundings with the remnants of their failing tech. They debated endlessly about the properties of local flora, the migration patterns of small rodent-like creatures that darted between roots, the potential threat levels of unfamiliar fungi. They argued over shelter design models pulled from memory, none of which matched the curvature of the native trees. They tried to construct shelters with symmetrical precision, using tools far too delicate for raw survival work. By noon, half of them were exhausted from effort and frustration. The other half were shivering in the unexpected chill that settled despite the filtered sunlight. The forest wasn't dangerous in any obvious way. No beast prowled, no venomous plants attacked. But it didn't yield easily either. Everything was slightly off. The bark too fibrous to split, the vines too elastic to hold form, the trees too tall for low-hanging branches. Everything resisted control. Alara found a thick-rooted tree with wide limbs about 2 meters above the ground and started her work. She moved with silent efficiency, hacking with her blade, stripping vines with her hands, testing branch strength by body weight rather than theory. Within an hour, she had the base of a platform. By the third, she had a crude but stable floor. When a cadet wandered too close, watching her from behind a twisted fern, she ignored him completely. By sunset, she had a fire going. Real flame. The cadets' eyes glowed in the reflection of it from their high-set sockets, wide and curious and uneasy. They huddled in poorly constructed lean-tos that collapsed with even mild wind gusts. Their food, unidentified mushrooms and hard-shelled seed pods, remained untouched, uncertain, and untested. Kelrix, one of the younger cadets, ventured closer. His voice was quiet. "How did you make fire?" Alara stirred her tin pot slowly, the heat rising in gentle waves. Friction, dry fibers, muscle memory. "That is primitive." "It works," she said, taking a sip. "Primitive tends to survive where smart gets stuck." He lingered. The other cadets hissed softly at him from the shadows, disapproving. But Kelrix didn't retreat. Instead, he sat, mimicking her cross-legged posture. His gaze scanned her treehouse, a skeletal frame still in progress, but already solid, anchored, defensible. "You won't help us, will you?" he asked after a moment. "No," she replied without hesitation. "But you're smart enough to help each other." He didn't answer, but when he stood, he didn't return to the others. Instead, he walked into the woods with sharpened stick and began gathering vines. By the time darkness fully claimed the forest, Alara's shelter had a roof of moss and leaves, and she was seated in its mouth, elevated just enough to look down on cadets scattered below like confused hatchlings. A few had started mimicking her fire pit, fumbling with sticks, grunting with frustration. One had even fashioned a stone blade, clumsily tied to a branch. She leaned back against the tree trunk and exhaled. It wasn't satisfaction she felt. It was inevitability. Strip the tech away, and most species panicked. Strip the tools, the comforts, the code. They flailed. Humans? Humans had always built from nothing. With bare hands and stubby teeth, they had outlasted ice ages, scaled mountains, crossed voids. She knew, because she'd been taught the old ways. Not in a simulation, but in backwoods camps on deserted worlds, by mentors who didn't believe in safeties or second tries. Below her, one of the shelters collapsed entirely, with a muffled crash and an alien curse. A brief wave of shouting followed. Another cadet tried to fix it, using rigid logic where flexibility was needed. They hadn't learned yet to listen to the environment instead of trying to dominate it. She sipped again from her tin. The broth was weak but warm. The wind shifted, and the trees moaned above as if sharing a secret. Somewhere deep in the forest, a beast howled, long, low, and distant. She didn't flinch, but below her, the cadets all looked up at once. The night was just beginning. The morning mist clung to the forest like a second skin, veiling the trees in a shroud of silence broken only by the occasional creak of swaying branches and the distant clicking of insectoid wildlife. Dew beaded on twisted vines and pooled in the hollow of leaves. Beneath the towering canopy, the Xerian cadets emerged from their miserable night with sluggish movements and scowling faces. Most looked worse than they had the night before, mud-streaked, sleep-deprived, and bitterly cold despite their resilient biology. Kelrix was the first to stand. His joints ached from where he'd tried to sleep on a makeshift bedding of moss and bark, but his mind was sharper than ever. He glanced toward the tree where Alara's structure loomed, its crude frame now shingled with wide fern leaves. Smoke curled upward from her campfire in a steady spiral, the smell of broth faint on the breeze. She hadn't come down. She hadn't said a word. The cadets regrouped hesitantly, drawn to each other by habit more than strategy. Two of them, Raya and Tren, were nursing minor injuries from falling branches and unstable structures. Voss, who had insisted on eating a purple pod fruit the night before, sat pale and retching near a root cluster. The silence between them all was thick and accusing. "Half of us are sick or useless," muttered Krail, his voice tight with suppressed frustration. "This is ridiculous. We're not primitive beasts. We shouldn't be left to survive like one. You think complaining will build a shelter?" Kelrix said quietly. Krail turned to him with narrowed eyes. "I didn't ask you." Kelrix met his stare. "You don't have to. You failed like the rest of us. All your calculations, your perfect angles, your data pattern shelters, gone with one wind gust. We're not here to prove we're smart. We're here to survive. We were given no warning. No equipment." Another cadet offered, trying to sound reasonable. "This wasn't in the curriculum." "It wasn't supposed to be," Kelrix replied. He gestured toward Alara, who now crouched at the edge of her platform, tying together a woven ladder of vines. "Look at her. No gadgets. No armor. She's done more in one day than all of us together. She built a fortress while we froze in puddles." Tren snorted. "She's human. That's what they do. Grit and bone and dirt. They evolved in chaos." Kelrix didn't smile. "Then maybe we should stop arguing and start learning." With that, he walked toward the pile of discarded sticks and failed projects from the night before. One by one, he picked out usable pieces, long, flexible limbs, twisted vines, forked branches. He worked quietly, Focus on replicating the simplest element of Alera's structure, the base. He tied, tested, and adjusted. It wasn't elegant, but it held. By midday, others began to drift toward him, not quite committing but watching with renewed interest. Even Crail lingered nearby, occasionally muttering criticisms that he didn't seem confident in. Eventually, two cadets, Raya and Selleck, joined Kelrix, hauling branches and copying his knots. When one broke, they fixed it. When a joint wobbled, they rebuilt. Above them, Alera finally descended. Not a word, not a smile, just a glance at the structure before she passed them. She moved to a thicket nearby and began harvesting bark strips with her blade. Her calm presence disrupted the uneasy energy around the camp. She didn't lead with commands. She led with movement. It was Selleck who broke the silence as Alera passed by him. "Why didn't you tell us how to build like this?" Alera looked at him as she stripped a thick ribbon of bark from a branch. "Because being told is the opposite of surviving. I could hand you instructions, but the next storm, the next failure, the next planet won't care what you memorized. You need to see it, feel it fail, then make it not fail." She walked off, leaving the cadets to absorb her words. Kelrix nodded to himself and doubled his efforts. By afternoon, a second platform was standing. It was crooked, uneven, and creaked ominously under weight. But it stood. Others began to assist in fortifying it, learning by doing. They constructed rope ladders from braided reeds, tested anchoring techniques with tree roots, and began carving rough tools out of stone and bone. Some cadets scavenged for dry kindling and finally, after several failed attempts, produced a small fire near the base of the largest tree. As twilight approached, Alera's treehouse stood fully completed, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The Xerian cadet structures, 3 of them now, stood like humble disciples surrounding a teacher's shrine. They weren't perfect, but they were proof adaptation was in progress. Still, tension simmered. Voss had recovered enough to speak, and his first words were bitter. "They expect too much from us. This test, it's not a test of intelligence. It's humiliation. She was placed here to watch us fail." Kelrix turned to him, his arms streaked with dirt, bark still clinging to his shoulders. "She wasn't placed here to watch us fail. She was placed here to show what surviving looks like. And we did fail. Yesterday. But today we didn't." Voss scoffed and limped away. That evening, the cadets gathered around a shared fire. Their shelters swayed but didn't collapse. Their food, still mostly forage roots and bitter leaves, was boiled in makeshift bark bowls over hot stones. Alera remained apart, seated high above, her shadow barely visible through the light leaking from her enclosed hut. For the first time, laughter emerged among the group, short, surprised bursts of it, as if the sound was unfamiliar. Crail told a crude joke about vine tension and gravity. Selleck mimicked Alera's stoic stare to exaggerated effect. It was thin, nervous bonding, but it was something. Then, without warning, the forest spoke. A long, low groan echoed through the trees, not mechanical, not wind, but a kind of breath. The fire snapped. The cadets froze. From the western edge of the clearing, a creature emerged. Tall and spindly, with translucent fur and 6 spindle legs, it stood at least 3 meters high. Its eyes glowed faintly violet, and its narrow head swiveled slowly. It did not charge. It did not growl. It simply observed, then stepped forward. Tren stumbled back. "What is that?" No one answered. The creature stepped closer, not aggressive, but not hesitant. The cadets scrambled, some reaching for crude spears, others preparing to run. Kelrix raised a hand, not to the creature, but to his peers. "Wait!" The creature stopped at the edge of the firelight, blinking. Then, after a moment of mutual stillness, it lowered its head and turned, vanishing back into the trees as silently as it had come. The group exhaled almost collectively. Alera's voice drifted down from her perch, quiet but audible. "You're not alone here. This place is alive, and it doesn't care who you are. If you want to survive, start listening instead of shouting." The cadets nodded slowly. The bravado had cracked. Beneath it, something deeper was forming, not just fear or caution, but respect. That night, the shelters held. The fire burned low and steady. The Xerian cadets slept for the first time with a sense of fragile security, surrounded by the wild hum of forest that had ceased to feel entirely foreign. Elara didn't sleep. She watched from above, her knife resting on her lap, and her eyes scanning the trees for shadows that didn't belong. She knew the real test hadn't even begun. Dawn broke pale and cold over the canopy, casting long ribbons of silver light across the treetop shelters. The air held a sharpness that hadn't been present the day before, as if the forest had decided to show a new facet of itself. From her perch, Elara could already hear movement below, quiet, purposeful steps, the scrape of stone on bark, the rustle of woven leaves. The Xerian cadets had begun to build without waiting for instruction. A small shift, perhaps, but to her, it meant everything. Kelrix was organizing the work, not with orders, but with example. He had been up before the others, reinforcing the joints of the structure, adjusting the angle of the platform to catch more light and trap less water. Tren and Raya followed his lead. They had begun to grasp what Elara had known from the start. Survival wasn't about strength or calculation. It was about responsiveness. Elara observed silently, her expression unreadable. She didn't interfere. That wasn't her role. Her only measure of their success was in their ability to solve their own problems. She chewed a piece of dried root, bitter and fibrous, then tossed the rest of the ground. The test was entering its most dangerous phase, not because of external threats, but because of internal pressure, hunger, fatigue, pride, the final catalyst of collapse. By midday, the forest changed again. The wind shifted direction with suddenness that made the trees groan. The cadets paused, sensing it as animals do, an invisible tension crawling along their exoskeletons. The light dimmed despite the hour, and birds that chirped high in the canopy went silent. Kelrix's voice cut through the hush. "We need to secure the shelters. Now." They moved fast, no longer needing persuasion. Vines were tightened, platforms weighted with stone, weak branches reinforced with cross-lashing. Selleck and Krail double-checked the supports, while Voss, still weak but recovering, collected dry leaves and fungus to cover exposed areas. The storm didn't wait. It came not with a roar, but a low, rolling growl of wind, like the forest breathing in reverse. Rain followed, not a drizzle, but a torrent, each drop thick and cold, soaking through shelter gaps in moments. The tree houses creaked under the strain. One of the smaller platforms collapsed under poor knotwork, sending 2 cadets scrambling for handholds. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. Complacency could still kill. Elara dropped to the ground in 3 quick movements, her boots landing in thick mud. Without a word, she approached the cadets now huddled beneath a canopy of leaves. They looked to her instinctively, eyes wide. "Don't retreat," she said. "Adapt." She passed them, picked up the shattered remnants of the platform, and pointed to a thicker tree. "Rebuild here. Use this root flare for support. Don't copy, design for this tree." Kelrix took the lead again, barking short commands. The others moved. Tools passed from hand to hand. Branches were lashed. Shelter was reformed under pressure. Above, lightning forked silently in the sky. The storm raged for 3 hours, lashing the canopy and soaking everything below. The cadets, now caked in mud and fatigue, didn't stop. Elara stood among them, not directing, but present, her gaze scanning constantly for danger or weakness. When she did speak, it was only to ask questions that forced them to think. Why did that joint fail? What's the weight ratio of your base limb? Where does the runoff collect? By the time the clouds broke, the camp had changed again. It wasn't just a cluster of shelters anymore. It was a system. Elevated walkways linked platforms. Fire pits were shielded. Water was collected and filtered through carved funnels. And most importantly, the cadets moved as a unit. That night, Elara built a small beacon from polished stone and old circuitry from her medkit, hidden carefully among the trees. It wasn't for rescue. It was a marker, a way for the next group to find what had been accomplished here. Krail approached her as she worked, his movement stiff but measured. He no longer carried the same simmering arrogance. He sat beside her, silent for a while. "I underestimated this," he said at last. All of it. You. This planet. Them. Alara didn't look at him. She secured the last wire and closed the casing. You weren't supposed to estimate. You were supposed to experience. I thought leadership meant having answers. She glanced at him now. Leadership means asking the right questions when no one else wants to. It means standing in the storm with your people, not above them. He considered that, then nodded. Kelrix, he's doing well. He's becoming what you all could be. They sat in silence for a few moments longer until a sound rose from the camp. A murmur, then laughter. Real, full-throated laughter. Not the brittle kind they'd shared before, but something deeper. It rolled through the trees like sunlight breaking through clouds. Krail rose. We've got one more night. I'd rather survive it with them than against them. He walked back toward the firelight, his silhouette framed by hanging moss and low smoke. Alara stood slowly and looked up. The stars had returned, crisp and cold above the canopy. But the peace didn't last long. In the deepest part of the night, a sharp sound cracked through the forest. Not natural, not wind. It was metal, twisting, snapping. The beacon. Alara was on her feet in seconds. She ran toward the source, knife in hand. She found the beacon smashed, crushed under something large. Tracks in the mud. Clawed, wide, deep. Something had been here. Something watching. Kelrix arrived behind her, panting. What? Alara pointed at the tracks. We're not alone, and whatever it is, it doesn't want us marking territory. Kelrix crouched near the prints, brushing mud aside. These weren't here yesterday. No, they weren't. She stood, her muscles coiled. Wake the others. Quietly. No panic. Reinforce everything. Post-watchers. We may have passed the survival test, but now the real threat begins. Kelrix nodded once and ran. Alara remained behind for a moment, her fingers brushing the broken circuitry. Now nothing but shards in the mud. The air had gone still again, but it was a false stillness, the kind that comes before another storm, not of wind and water, but of something older, wilder. She sheathed her blade and looked into the dark between the trees. The test had changed, and it wasn't finished yet. The forest held its breath. No birds called. No insects buzzed. The ambient hum that had underscored the cadets every moment since landing had faded into something unnatural, a silence too complete to be trusted. The trees themselves, once creaking and swaying with wind, stood rigid, sentinel-like. Moonlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting silvered patterns across the elevated walkways, the bark-hinged shelters, and the wary faces that now peered out from behind woven leaf walls. Alara paced the perimeter, silent and sharp-eyed. Her blade was loose in its sheath. The crushed beacon, still lying half buried in the mud beyond the perimeter, had been a message. It hadn't been random. Something had watched them. Something had waited. The Xerian cadets, now organized and purposeful, responded without question. Kelrix stood at the center of their coordination, his movements economical, voice low, but commanding. Patrols were arranged in rotating shifts. Tools were sharpened into spears. Fires were built higher along the outer platforms to ward off whatever lay in the darkness. There was no more talk of scoring high or outperforming one another. Now, it was about protecting the colony they'd built together. I don't think this thing is hunting, Selig murmured, crouching beside Alara as she examined a second set of prints near the riverbank. If it wanted to kill us, it could have done it in our sleep. Alara nodded slowly. It's testing us. Pushing, watching for fear. Maybe it's territorial. Maybe curious. Doesn't matter. It knows we're here. That changes the rules. Kelrix approached, holding a bundle of bones, the remains of some rodent-like creature native to the forest. These were crushed clean. Precision pressure. Whatever it is, it's strong and intelligent. No mess. No scavenging. Alara studied him for a beat. The Xerian's natural armor, once polished and sleek, was now dull with dirt and wear. His posture, once stiff with pride, had relaxed into something grounded. He wasn't posturing anymore. He was leading. The structures hold, he said quietly, but if it attacks in force, we can't fight it off. You won't need to. Ilera replied. If you're smart. The next hours were spent reinforcing weak points, raising alarms made from tension vines and hollow pods that would screech when tugged. Firelight danced across determined faces as the cadets worked, their shadows stretching long across the forest floor. Even Voss, who had lagged behind for most of the challenge, stood beside Riot to string a perimeter of thorns and stakes. But still, the forest did not return to its usual rhythm. When the attack came, it wasn't with fury. It came as a whisper, a flicker of movement in the trees, a creak of displaced weight. The pod alarm shrieked once, sharp and brief, then snapped apart with a loud crack. Something large moved fast through the underbrush, unseen, only suggested by swaying trunks and bursts of shifting shadow. The cadets froze. Hold position. Kelrick shouted from the central platform. Don't break formation. Selleck fired a warning flare, an improvised concoction of sap, stone powder, and spark, but arced too far and exploded against a distant trunk. The light revealed nothing, but the sudden illumination startled a shape, a blur of pale fur and long limbs, that vanished almost instantly into the trees. It's not attacking, Ilera whispered, perched on a branch above them all. It's circling. What does it want? Tren asked, his voice hushed but tight with fear. To see if you scatter, Ilera said. Don't. A moment passed, then another. The creature let out a low chuff, part exhale, part growl. It sounded almost amused. Then silence fell again. This time, the forest stayed still. For hours afterward, no more movement came. The alarms were reset, the fire relit, and the cadets took turns sleeping in shifts. No one spoke of victory. No one assumed it was over. But in that long, dark quiet, something shifted in all of them. They had not run. They had held. That was enough. Morning came slowly, the sky bleeding into pale yellow as light returned to the high branches. The forest seemed to exhale, its tension broken. Birds chirped cautiously. Insects buzzed. Normalcy returned in layers. When Commander Vrela's transport arrived, silent, hovering above the treetops, it went almost unnoticed. The cadets didn't rush to greet him. They were too busy boiling water, drying out gear, cleaning wounds. They didn't stand in neat lines or offer rehearsed reports. Vrel descended into the camp, his narrow eyes scanning the structures with measured surprise. Elevated walkways connected 6 reinforced shelters, rope ladders, fire pits, food caches, a defensive perimeter of thorns and pressure-based alarms. Smoke curled upward in controlled plumes. You have exceeded expectations, he said after a long moment. No one answered immediately. Then Kelrick stepped forward. We didn't come here to exceed expectations. Commander, we came here to survive. And we nearly didn't. Ilera stepped out from behind one of the support trunks, her hands resting on the hilt of her blade. They learned more than your curriculum ever intended. Vrel raised an eyebrow. So it would seem. Selleck stepped forward, dirt-smudged and confident. We're not the same cadets that landed here. And when the next group arrives, they'll find our outpost ready for them. The commander looked around once more, then nodded. The challenge is complete. Prepare for departure. But none of the cadets moved. They looked to Kelrick's, who looked to Ilera. We'd like to stay, he said. Vrela's expression tightened. The test is finished. It is, Kelrick agreed. But the real work has just started. This forest, this outpost, we've made something that can last. We've built something real. Ilera said nothing, but the faint smile on her face betrayed her approval. Vrel considered, then gave a single nod. 3 more days, then you return. As he rose back into his transport, the cadets resumed their tasks, not because they had to, but because they understood why they must. That night, Ilera stood at the highest platform, watching the stars wink into existence between the leaves. Kelrick joined her, a makeshift journal of bark and ink in his hands. We're calling it the human method, he said with a smile. Adapt first, think second, survive always. She chuckled. You're still thinking. Yeah, he said, but now I do it with a blade in my belt and calluses on my hands. He offered her the journal. Add something. She took it, then scrawled in thick, angular strokes. The forest will teach you, if you let it, but it starts by humbling you. They stood in silence again, the night now warm, the trees once more part of the world, and not its adversary. Below, laughter rose from the fires again. It was no longer a test. It was a beginning,